Why did the Silent Hill series slowly fall out of favor with players? While the first few games are widely considered to be some of the greatest horror titles ever made, opinions on the later ones are at best mixed. Is it simply that with the disbandment of the studio that started the franchise and developed the first 4 titles, that without being made in that environment, later games were doomed? I mean, that definitely plays a big part, I'd say. But did it have to be the final nail in the coffin for the series? After all, plenty of franchises change hands and creative talent, and continue to thrive and receive beloved releases years later. Even if it can be an uphill battle to recapture the magic after a series leaves its birthplace, it's not impossible. So what makes it so uniquely hard for Silent Hill to do so? Well, let's compare Silent Hill to another horror franchise which is currently thriving and at its peak after more than 25 years, Resident Evil, a series that's changed hands multiple times and gone through drastic changes in design. Looking at the success of Resident Evil, there's a few things it has that Silent Hill lacks. A returning cast of characters, an ongoing story, and a core mechanical identity. When Resident Evil strays from its mechanical origins, it still has its cast of characters or ongoing story on standby to reassure you you're playing Resident Evil. When those characters aren't around, it can focus in on the original mechanical core of the series to reassure you you're playing Resident Evil. Silent Hill, though, doesn't have any of these things. Each SH game stars a different protagonist who we never see again after the game ends, unless you want to flag up some really pedantic examples or technicalities. In terms of an overall plot, the one time a Silent Hill game directly followed up the story of a previous one, it used that opportunity to wrap everything up. Mechanically, the series has always been a watered-down Resident Evil. SH1 took the basic gameplay of classic Resi and reduced to the complexity and difficulty. It removed the limited inventory system, it took away saving restrictions, it updated the player's map for them, etc. The survival gameplay is basic and expanded on fairly little in the first few titles. If you set about making a new Silent Hill game, what exactly do you do? There's no ongoing plot left to continue, there's no characters with unresolved arcs to follow up on, and even if you were to make some new predicament up for one of them, it's kind of a tradition at this point that every Silent Hill game star a new protagonist. One that any new dev would be too scared to break. There's some understanding that yes, these are venerated titles with beloved characters that nobody wants to be responsible for making an underwhelming epilogue for. On the other hand, building on the mechanics of Silent Hill, expanding and making them more complex, seems like a redundant, thankless task. You could make the most intricate, in-depth systems a survival horror game has seen, and that wouldn't be enough to please the Silent Hill fanbase. You'd basically just be playing catch-up with where Resident Evil's gameplay is at now. Maybe Resident Evil fans would enjoy your game, but Silent Hill fans? I'm not so sure. SH4 has probably some of the most mechanically demanding horror gameplay of the series. And not to say this is the one contributing factor, but out of all Silent Hill fans I've crossed paths with, usually they're likely to have beaten Origins or Homecoming before The Room. This isn't to say that a Silent Hill game with complex survival horror mechanics would be a bad thing, maybe. Just that it's understandable that a dev wouldn't want to dedicate such a huge chunk of their time to that aspect when it's never been something the series has been loved for. What made Silent Hill different from Resident Evil and interesting wasn't that it had some fresh or in-depth mechanical take on survival horror, because it didn't. It was that it used a basic survival gameplay framework to present a uniquely fascinating, esoteric dark world for the player to immerse themselves in. So there you have it, right? It's in the name, Silent Hill. That's what makes Silent Hill unique. But how sustainable is one town as the crux of your franchise? Horror is about stepping into the unknown, but how unknown is Silent Hill at this point to the average player? This is one reason why it makes sense to always have a new protagonist. At least they can act scared and confused about being in this weird new place, but that's not necessarily going to translate to the player. Even when the original team were working on the games, I think this limitation was dawning on them. Silent Hill 3 takes place outside of Silent Hill for half the time, and that was after only 2 games completely set in the town. But there's always going to be a pull back to that location because of the title of the series being what it is, and that's an issue and limitation other horror game franchises don't suffer from. Okay, But why was Silent Hill a uniquely interesting place to explore? What was interesting about it that other horror games didn't have? It wasn't just that it was a creepy town or had terrifically designed monsters lurking around. It had the added flourish that a lot of the horror was manifested by the trauma of various characters. And while it's not the only factor that made those games compelling, absolutely yes, you can argue this is a core pillar of the Silent Hill series, just as much a staple as any recurring protagonist or unique mechanical systems would be. What makes SH stand apart is that it's horror gaming that explores the psyche of characters by having their inner thoughts and feelings projected onto reality. And in the late 90s and early 2000s, this gimmick allowed Silent Hill to stand apart from the competition in the horror gaming market. But there's one problem. In present day, so many horror-themed games do this. It's not hard to trip over loads of spooky games now that have some segment where we see someone's dark inner thoughts manifesting as imagery. Even Resident Evil, a series about lab experiments gone wrong, does this now, and really well. Not just that, but other franchises have the benefit of this still getting to be a surprise when it happens. If you brand your game Silent Hill, you've basically given that surprise away in the title. Oh, these creepy monsters and environments are going to be the manifestation of someone's trauma? Wow, shocker. I would never have guessed. In the original Silent Hill, the fact that's what's happening is something you piece together over the course of the game. And in the first few titles, to keep things fresh, the devs played around with who the character projecting the nightmare was going to be, and what role and alignment they had in the story, so this element could still have a bit of surprise to it. But there's only so many ways you can present this concept before it becomes mundane. We've already cycled through so many types of trauma projected by so many people. At least if it happens in Resident Evil, you're going to be taken aback by it. All of this is why, as a fan of Silent Hill, it's impossible for me to ask for more games. Because what am I asking for? There's better places to get mechanically stimulating survival horror. I never went to Silent Hill for that anyway. There are no plot threads left dangling, no main characters with an unfinished journey I want to see again. If I want levels built out of trauma and repressed feelings, it's not exactly something I'm hurting for in this genre anymore. And at the moment, it's actually more appealing to jump into a different franchise and perhaps be surprised if it happens. Anyone setting out to make a new Silent Hill game is in an especially difficult place. I don't think I'd wish it on anyone. With no ongoing plot or cast of characters, very little mechanical identity, and every arguably intrinsic aspect of the series having a sell-by date, could even the original creators have continued this series beyond where they did? Well, considering how final SH3 felt, and how supposedly SH4 wasn't even conceived as a traditional Silent Hill sequel, or possibly a Silent Hill game at all, before being reworked into the next numbered game, maybe they didn't think so. But yeah, I think that was the time and place to do it, if at all. Sure, even at the original studio, different creators and developers would swap out for each other during the creation of the first 4 titles. But I think if we went back in time to 2004, and had the people who had been working on SH3 and 4 make an SH5, it probably would have felt very Silent Hill, no matter the subject matter or gameplay, by being incubated in the same environment as the last few titles. With a lot of key figures who worked on the first 3 games not contributing significantly, 4 definitely feels like the most different of the original quadrilogy. Yet, even for all its weirdness, it has a certain Silent Hill feel to the presentation and mood. With just a location and a couple of concepts to hang your entire franchise on, that almost undefinable atmosphere the original Silent Hills evoked is about the only other thing you're left with as a core fundamental pillar. If you could replicate that specific feel and mood decades later in a game, maybe that would be enough for it to become a beloved Silent Hill sequel. But I'd say it's also the hardest thing to replicate now at a different studio so many years later. If you have mechanics that define your series, or mainstay characters who suit going on multiple adventures, you don't have to replicate those intangible feelings atmosphere, directing style, and presentation bring quite as perfectly to make an authentic sequel. But with SH, it's a much bigger deal. This is why, say, remaking the old games is probably not a great idea either. I mean, first of all, if the plan is not to repeat ourselves like later Silent Hill games did because of the franchise's inherent limitations, then remaking is obviously not going to fix that. But also because with the atmosphere of these games being so delicate, yet so fundamentally important to those first titles, their textures, their lighting and sound, their direction, the quirks and details of the characters and enemy designs presented, trying to have a new team replicate it isn't just impossible, but fairly pointless. It already exists as it was intended. If you haven't played the old Silent Hills or games from this generation in general, keep in mind that when you hear people gush over a game like Silent Hill 2 so often, they're not gushing over the idea of Silent Hill 2 in concept. They're gushing over an old PS2 game. That's what Silent Hill 2 is, with its PS2 textures and design and presentation and the dialogue and acting that exist in that old disc. Silent Hill 2 and PS2 game aren't two separate concepts, they're one and the same. In this video, I've talked about the reasons that make it hard to conceptualize more Silent Hill games, but that's not to say you couldn't make a good game tomorrow called Silent Hill. I think there are inherent issues that make elongating SH into a large franchise difficult, but of course there are quality issues independent of those concerns that plagued later Silent Hill games. The best Silent Hill game made after the original studio disbanded is probably Shattered Memories. It's not entirely my cup of tea, but it has its merits. The thing is, narratively and mechanically, it has almost nothing in common with previous games. It's even set in a separate universe entirely. You can consider Shattered Memories a good game, but you'd be hard-pressed, I think, to say it's a great continuation of the Silent Hill series. And that's really the issue. If the best effort at making another game in this franchise had practically nothing to do with Silent Hill, then what's the point of it being called Silent Hill? As discussed, that branding would, if anything, work against it, weighing this new concept down by giving the player expectations that may not be met. I have no doubt a great game with Silent Hill written on the box will come out again one day. But most likely, it will be a similar situation to Shattered Memories. A good game that just happens to carry the moniker. Probably with some Easter eggs and references in there to tickle nostalgia. By some people's metrics, a game with Silent Hill in the title that has a big Metacritic score will be enough to say the series has returned to form. But to me, it would be playing pretend. Pretending Silent Hill is still a franchise just for the sake of it. And personally, I'd rather just move on than delude myself that what I loved is still alive in something different.
I don't look like a ghost, do I?